let me also say, like, how honored I am that you all, picked me and allowed me to kind of be the maiden voyage on this thing. And just a big shout out to the whole team. Wild West Hackfest was amazing, and the ability for that team to take something that was going to be physical and turn it into something that was virtual so quickly and have it be so successful. Just huge shout out to that whole team. So again, thank you for the opportunity, and I feel humbled and honored that I can get things started here. So without any further ado, I guess we can jump right into the quick start guide to MITRE ATT&CK, and the subtitle, of course, being the do's and don'ts when using the matrix. And hopefully, as we kind of go through, all of this will begin to make more sense, and really it'll crystallize, hopefully, for everyone kind of who this talk is for as we go down. Now, to that end, let's talk about who this talk is for. So this is the high-level quick preface of everything. First off, the slides will be shared at the end, so you don't need to take a million screenshots or screen recording or anything like that, and this is all going to be recorded and shared in video format later. But yeah, I will give these slides at the end of this show, so that'll be fine. I will also provide sources for the things and references that I make. I try to do some attribution in the slides themselves, but you'll also have those in the speaker notes there when you download these slides. And I'm going to use some memes in this just to help. Hopefully convey and maybe bring a little bit of humor to it, but there's also text of what those kind of memes represent in the speaker notes, which again are provided at the end. Cool. So really quick, who am I? I'm Adam Mashinchi, and I'm often mistaken for these other two gentlemen, but this is me. And so I am the VP of Product Management at Scythe, and Scythe we're a software organization that makes a software platform that does adversary emulation, simulation. Basically, the long and the short of it is we make a web interface that makes custom malware that's very modular and pluggable and allows you to do all sorts of fun things. I also volunteer with the Red Team Village at DEF CON, and I'm a volunteer and speaker with them. I help run their 101 track, and my background is in enterprise solutions kind of holistically and how to build those and bring them to market and that sort of thing. But I also am personally very passionate about and have a background in cryptography and privacy, even though I'm kind of focusing on this red team automation stuff right now with Scythe, which is a lot of fun. So who is this presentation for, and why should you care? This presentation is for people who are curious about MITRE ATT&CK, and it's something you've heard a lot about and know really nothing about, except for what you've maybe gleaned off of other conversations or heard from vendors. And this is tailored for folks that are red teamers, blue teamers, purple teamers, whatever, IT defense, IT offense, whatever you want to call it. And the goal is that not only will we talk about what the attack matrix is, but would also reinforce how it can and maybe should be used. And I'll bring in some industry insights from some experts. I'll hopefully give you some new analogies and metaphors as we go through it. And there'll also be, again, further reading and takeaways at the end. The last slide here we'll cover, in addition to these slides themselves. So what this conversation is, it's going to be a very, very fast review of the MITRE ATT&CK matrix framework, whatever we want to call it, and I'm definitely going to oversimplify a lot of topics, so heads up, that's going to happen. I will mention some tools, and I will bring you some feedback from some actual people, and to give you some direct quotes even on those. But it's important to note, even though that's what this conversation is, this conversation is not going to be 100% comprehensive in any sort of way, shape, or form. Again, it's just some new insights. I'm not going to rehash the 101 guide, that there is actually a 101 guide. I'm not just going to copy and paste out of that. I'm not going to be providing any how-to guide for some tools, and I'm going to do my best with attribution, but it's not going to be perfect. I'll try, but you'll note that sometimes I put Twitter handles right in the bottom there. And again, those are in the speaker notes. Cool. So let's go ahead and get started, shall we? First off, the problem, and this is becoming more and more of a problem every day. And here's a couple of tweets that I really like. Yeah, one is from Bryson Bort. My next presentation will be a MITRE ATT&CK review of MITRE ATT&CK using MITRE ATT&CK. This is the kind of way we're framing this, and the vendors are eating up this term. It's appearing a lot, but that's not really helpful. Like, great, there's this term MITRE ATT&CK. What does it actually mean? I love Mark Orlando's response to that as well. It's pretty good. Another one is here from Beth Young. Got a piece of marketing spam today claiming their product was, quote, substantially MITRE ATT&CK framework compliant. I wonder how that works. And to which the attack team says, fake news, right? There's not really a compliancy bit to it. And so now that we're hearing all of this MITRE ATT&CK, MITRE ATT&CK, MITRE ATT&CK, it can be kind of difficult to gauge what this thing is and is not. So what is MITRE ATT&CK? Well, first let's break the term up into its two parts here. MITRE. What is MITRE? Well, MITRE is a not-for-profit, federally funded R&D shop, basically. They do a lot of great work. They've got a great team. They've got some open source stuff. Like, they're a great organization. So that's what MITRE is. ATT&CK. ATT&CK is a matrices or a series of matrices. It's a grid, basically, and it's a grid of threat actor behaviors that are identified by various IDs. There are 4-digit IDs today. And so, again, it's just this idea of it's a framework, it's a grid of tactics, techniques, procedures, TTPs, and their corresponding IDs of what threat actors do from an industry perspective. And for the sake of this conversation, we'll call a threat actor, it's an adversary as seen in the cybersecurity industry. Okay, so MITRE, organization, ATT&CK, grid of techniques. Neat. And there's actually multiple MITRE ATT&CK matrices or matrices, whatever. There's a bunch of them. There's one called pre-attack. There's one called mobile. There's one for ICS, industrial control systems. For the sake of this conversation, we don't care about those other ones. We're just going to talk about the enterprise matrix. And for most folks, that'll probably be the one you look at. And it's broken down into Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and cloud. But again, we'll focus on the enterprise attack matrix today. So ATT&CK, again, that grid is maintained by MITRE. Here we have a picture of the MITRE ATT&CK team, and their the figurehead of the MITRE ATT&CK team is Blake Strom. That's Blake Strom. There we go. And here's just a handful of folks that are, if you're interested in following them on Twitter, there you go. They're all good MITRE ATT&CK folks. They're all been the part of the core team at one point or another. Okay, so who the do's and the don'ts? That's what you're all here for. But now that we know what this thing is, how should we think about it? Well, this number one is kind of the most important lesson I think I can garner today. Please use the MITRE ATT&CK matrix and all the techniques in it as a common language. It's the idea that regardless of where you are in an organization, whether it be on the org chart or which department you're in or which your red team or blue team or offense, defense, it doesn't matter. The point is the MITRE ATT&CK matrix can be used as a common language that everyone can get on the same page about the kind of threats that exist in this cyber industry landscape and potentially some methods to detect or defend against those techniques. And so the idea is that, yes, there's 1,000 different formats of things you could provide, YAML files and interesting charts and grades and all these sorts of things. But at the end of the day, pretty much everybody can understand a big grid with some boxes colored in and one of them says keylogger, right? Everybody can kind of understand that, regardless of whether or not they're executive or technical. And so this idea of the MITRE ATT&CK framework as a common language can be a really key cornerstone of the way we think about it and the way we transfer information inside of an organization. And what's nice is you don't really have to be a hyper-mature organization to begin thinking in this way. For example, if you want to start to identify, well, how does my organization think about keyloggers, both from a management perspective, from a risk perspective, from an attack and defense perspective? You could say, well, let's just focus on this one technique ID today and see what we think about that. Is the keylogger technique our number one risk? Or is there maybe another thing in this grid that we should be focusing on more? Or maybe today we want to focus on noticing keyloggers the most and example versions of those things. Or maybe we want to try to emulate a keylogger. Again, a common language. That's the biggest lesson, I hope, is as far as the takeaway goes that we can talk about today. So that's a do. Let's talk about a don't. Please do not make attack, a checklist, or focus on coverage of the entire matrix, right? Again, using it as a common language is all right, but don't say, oh, we were successfully able to detect that one type of keylogger. We're done. Keyloggers are solved. Check, right? Do not think about it that way, because these things can grow over time. These are generalized or almost philosophical behaviors. And so even though there might be example commands to how to execute that behavior or certain detections that is recommended in the matrix for you, that's all well and good. But it is organic. Threat actors change over time, and so do the way we talk about them. And the MITRE ATT&CK Matrix itself is quite organic. So don't think about it as, oh, we've now solved privilege escalation in our organization, or we've now tested for all the privilege escalation in our enterprise. Don't think of it that way. That's a quick way to kind of lose the battle and really misinterpret what MITRE ATT&CK Matrix is. Okay, to that end, I recommend that you seek out behavior, not signatures. And here's an example. So MITRE ATT&CK ID T1124, that's system time discovery. That is a behavior that threat actors are known to do. Let's take an example, I don't know, APT123. In version 1 of that malware from APT123, they test for T1124. That threat actor uses the command nettime /hostname, right? Cool. Well, that's the threat actor. That's an example of how they do it. So therefore, net.exe and that specific command must be bad. And maybe we need a signature on that. And now we've solved T1124. Well, no, again, see, that's too specific. It's narrowing in on kind of the wrong thing. That's a signaturing of a specific command. It's not focusing on the behavior. The threat actor behavior is discovering the system time, and there's a lot of ways to do that. So for example, if APT123 rolls out version 2 of their malware and it uses PowerShell get date, you're now sad, right? Because you focused on that one specific method of executing that behavior, and that's turned itself into a signature. Okay, so seek out behaviors, not signatures. Great. Another way to think about that is the MITRE ATT&CK Matrix is a periodic table for adversaries. So this is the idea that these are all elements that make up an adversary, and they are the chemical makeup, right? The context, the order of the techniques, the state they go through. These are all things that those different MITRE ATT&CK IDs build up to. But individually, each of the boxes and techniques themselves, they're just inert objects, right? They're not to be taken as, oh, well, if all of these techniques were used, and we know that APT123 does all those techniques, that must be APT123. That's not the right way to think about it. Right, but it is a good way to, again, a common language for the way adversaries work. So thinking about it as that periodic table is a really helpful way to kind of utilize it and make it more transferable. Also, to that end, you can use a lot of examples as a foundation for thinking about behavior, as long as it's not your end-all be-all. So some easy ways to test for adversarial behavior. One example is CALDERA. It's an open source project. It's by the MITRE team. It creates these agents and they fire a series of commands on various endpoints. And that's great. But the goal of that kind of tool is to make validation trivial. Okay, it's the idea that we should be able to use these examples and quickly test our foundations quickly and easily. And the playbooks that are included are a baseline to get you comfortable with that tool and to get you comfortable with that kind of detection. But it's not the end-all be-all. It's not saying, oh, well, we ran this discovery threat and now we've got discovery solved. So use these kinds of tools as a foundation to really understand how you fit and what your risk profile is with the various technique IDs. Brief pause here for a moment. Okay, do not assume, and I mentioned this a wee bit earlier, but do not assume TTP is a given threat actor, because threats and TTPs themselves are nuanced. They're often very tricky to replicate with your tooling. And so often, again, if we have a collection of techniques in our mind or collection IDs and say, oh, well, this must be that threat actor, well, not only is it difficult to test against that, but if you do, and you are able to successfully check those boxes in your mind, you've now got a false sense of security, because those threat actors do change, and those TTP concepts do change slightly in implementation, especially when we're talking about signatures versus behaviors, because threat actors might run certain commands in a very specific order. And if you depend on that order to say, oh, well, this is that threat actor that we defend against, and now that's bad behavior, well, what if they change that a couple of steps in that, or what if they add additional delays? So decoupling techniques from threat actors is really critical, and not getting into that false sense of security. Oh, well, if something lights up all of these alarms, that must be that threat actor, and we can defend against that, right? So don't let yourself be lulled into that. And to that end, think of it instead as a game of minesweeper. This is a really great analogy. And shout out to Jeff McJunkin for being the one that I first heard talk about this. The attacker perspective, if they're thinking about the MITRE ATT&CK Matrix, is this is a game of minesweeper, and they don't know which of the techniques that you as a defender might have detections for. And so as they execute these various techniques, they're running a risk of whether or not your alarms will be triggered on those techniques. And the threat actor has to weigh the cost benefit of attempting that technique, because something might be of high value, but also might be of high risk. And so thinking of the attacker perspective, this is a game of minesweeper, and the attacker may or may not know when the defense is alerted on a given technique. That's a really elegant way to think about these sorts of adversary behaviors, and especially from a matrix context. Again, you can kind of one-for-one this game of minesweeper with that matrix. Okay. Quick anecdote, which is fun. There is an organization that has done this before. You put a bunch of MITRE ATT&CK Matrix techniques up on a wheel, and you spin it when you're doing a red team engagement, and whichever one you land on, you have to test on a given endpoint. It's kind of fun. You should just, if you're to do this sort of thing, it's kind of exciting, and it's a kind of interesting way to spice up your red team engagement with the MITRE ATT&CK technique wheel. For some reason, these wheels are really expensive on Amazon. I don't know. Anyway, just fun little anecdote of the way some organizations have used techniques in creative or interesting ways. Okay, so this, as a quick preface to this don't, there's some things that I really love, and some organizations that are great. Red Canary, as a team, they're awesome. That company is great, and they do some great work, and they open source some great things. One of those great things is Atomic Red Team. Atomic Red Team is awesome. It's a collection of really practical examples about how to test for some of these specific techniques. So there's some awesome commands in there. Again, it's a great baseline. I love all of these things. That's my preface to this next slide. Okay. Please do not copy, paste, enter commands that might test for things without fully understanding what those things do. I am not entirely sure how, as the cybersecurity industry, we have become okay with this kind of thing, where you're just like, hey, copy and paste this PowerShell command. It downloads a thing off of Bitly and then, invokes an arbitrary command on it, and try this on your endpoints. And that'll totally be a cool test for you. Please don't do that. Learn what these examples do before you try them out. It's really important, because some of these things may not be as benign as you think they are. So just as great of resources as some of these open source projects are, and they are fantastic, just be cautious, and more importantly, fully understand what you're testing before you test it. So that's just word of caution here. Okay. Another thing, don't forget that one technique and one command are not the same thing. Again, and it's easy to say after you're looking at an open source framework, oh, well, I use this command and it's that technique, and I copied and pasted, and we detected it or we didn't, and we're done, right? Because these techniques have different procedures and different preparations, and adversaries use them in different elegant ways. And sometimes what we've learned from a threat intel organization may not always be correct. And again, adversaries are dynamic. They're constantly changing. They're constantly finding new ways to hide and obfuscate themselves. And so these detections of these behaviors can be tricky, and trying to rely on a single command or group of series commands to say oh, well, that is that one technique, I've got that solved, is again the wrong way to think about it, because some of these techniques are more broad than that. Actually span multiple items on the MITRE ATT&CK Matrix sometimes. So again, kind of think of it philosophically, the matrix as a whole. Don't think of it as just a copy and paste. Okay, we've lit up this box and now we've solved that one. Okay. one kind of last thing that I think is really critical. Don't forget your other standards. There's a lot of standards out there, and depending on your organization, you may or may not need to abide by these things. And as great as the MITRE ATT&CK Matrix is, you can't forego your other compliance frameworks for it. If these are things you have to meet, whether it's the NIST 5 functions or cyber defense matrix or whatever, you have to prioritize which of these standards you're applying to, depending on what your organization is, especially if there's a legal requirement there. So there's a lot of models. They're not intended to be bingo cards, but generally speaking, as great as MITRE ATT&CK is, and all these products and organizations are aligning to it, you still have to prioritize what framework you must apply to first. Okay. To summarize, MITRE ATT&CK, it's a framework. Use it as a common language for TTPs, for these techniques. Use it as a way to talk to executives. Use it as a way to talk across the organization, whether it's cyber offense or defense. That common language for these techniques is really critical. And use it as a baseline for behaviors. You don't need to invent your own keylogger to get started. There's great examples of how to do that. And use them as a kickoff point to say, well, this is how we're going to test for this technique, or this is how we're going to detect against this technique. But it's a baseline, it's not the end-all be-all. And one thing that's really important is MITRE ATT&CK is now everywhere, and rightfully so. It's a great framework. And as an aside, it's a great way to get involved. There's lots of open source projects, there's lots of communities, there's lots of Q&As happening, there's lots of blogs that need to be written and webinars to give. So the more you are learning about this, the more you're utilizing it. There's so much opportunity to get involved with the MITRE ATT&CK Matrix, and I can't recommend getting involved enough. So, one last thing. This entire presentation was hopefully kind of helpful to you as a way to, again, to understand what MITRE ATT&CK Matrix is, and you're going to be hearing a lot about it later. My last kind of bit is, none of this is going to matter soon because the MITRE ATT&CK Matrix is going to roll out these things called sub-techniques, and the whole thing is going to get kind of crazy then. So we'll see how it all goes, and maybe I'll have to update this presentation when sub-techniques go. It'll be fun either way. So with that, I'm kind of done. If there's questions, if we have time, we may not have time. And then, of course, I will put this up here. So the speaker notes for these slides are at that URL, along with some of the further reading. And if you're interested in Scythe and kind of the way that works and how we do MITRE ATT&CK stuff and how we do adversary emulation stuff, there's some URLs there as well. So for some additional content, and if you want to learn more, try it out, that's all there. And with that, I'm done and open for questions.
Sure. If anyone, so far we don't have any. Just thank you. But if you have questions, this is the perfect time to ask them. We have 6 minutes remaining in our 30-minute block here. So if you do have questions, feel free to ask them. If you're waiting for others to ask questions, don't. Just go ahead and ask.
Yeah, dive on in.
Yeah. I do have a question for you. Is you know, as a person who does red team and threat emulation, like, and you said there's a spinning wheel and things like that, but really, is there a process that you've figured out and your team has figured out over time? It's like, let's start here, let's go there, and this generally works for most organizations.
Yeah, the thing that there's kind of an effort to value ratio on everything, of course. One place I think is good to start is if you're doing red teaming or pen testing, figure out what the organization thinks to be very, very valuable, but also is very easy to achieve when you're doing a test. A quick example, taking screenshots. Taking screenshots is a trivial operation, especially if you're doing it like on Windows, for example. There are system calls that you can call from the user space and can be fired, and screenshots give you all sorts of stuff. It gives you user data, it gives you files, it gives you passwords on occasion, and that sort of thing. So if an organization says, well, this kind of content, whether it's social security numbers or otherwise, this is the most critical content, and if anybody was to get this, that would be really bad. You could say, oh, well, here's the technique that identifies that, and we as pen testers or red teamers know that we can easily achieve that inside of a handful of seconds once you've touched down in an organization. Well, go for that one first. I mean, if that is both highly critical to an organization and easy to achieve from a technical perspective, go for that. And then as you do more and more engagements, I recommend folks gather up a library of the kind of standard operations that they want to do, especially ones that can be automated. You know, it's always important to note that a lot of these threat actor behaviors can be automated, whether it's screenshots, whether it's keyloggers, whether it's finding files and exfiltrating them. A lot of that stuff doesn't require human interaction, as it turns out. And even things like ransomware testing, you can write benign ransomware that runs all real ransomware behaviors, and you could test and validate whether or not their controls detect that. So again, it's the value to difficulty ratio, and I think there's things like screenshots are kind of a no-brainer. If that answers the question, hopefully.
Yep. So a couple questions came in. So from a blue teamer DIY emulation, quick win perspective, which is preferred, Caldera versus Atomic Red Team?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. So both of them have a lot of value, but they each have kind of eccentricities. So an example is, if you kind of know what you're doing, if you know how to run these commands, if you understand PowerShell runtimes and that sort of thing, Atomic Red Team can be kind of a no-brainer where it's very turnkey. But if you don't have that and you want something that's a little bit more of a GUI, a little more copy-paste, a little more click and drag, Caldera is really a great tool for that. Now, Caldera has its own eccentricities as well. There's a level of complexity. I call it the Caldera object tree, and it's probably on my Twitter somewhere. But the long and the short of it is they have pros and cons, and it really depends with how comfortable you are with executing things command line versus wanting to have a GUI. So it really depends on the skill set, because they both can be very quick wins. I will say, though, when it comes to testing an agent-based thing, Caldera is kind of a no-brainer, because there's like a copy-paste command to download and detonate an agent on an endpoint.
Have you seen any current mapping of the MITRE ATT&CK to either NIST or CIS top 20 controls?
Yes, I've seen some very early days things about references to that. It is still in the shoehorned phase. So there's nothing I can point to and say, that right there, that's the #1 recommendation. It's still very early days on that. That would be a good, like, ping me offline and I can kind of point towards some folks that are working towards it. But it's still very early days because it's tricky. Like they're not exactly one for one.
And then I think last question with the time that we have, and then if you can hop over to the Discord and answer some of the questions there, I think that would be super helpful. There's a link to the Discord in the chat, or if you're watching online, if this is the recording, then you can just take a look in the YouTube settings and you'll see it there.
Yeah.
Last one, without endorsing which SIEM or NSM platform, which covers the TTP behaviors best today?
Ooh. That's a tough one, especially. I would say that is totally dependent on the operator. A lot of these things do have what appear to be turnkey alignment and the like. In reality, an operator needs to filter this stuff and customize it, really. And so all the tooling kind of does generally a lot of the same stuff. But definitely, again, I couldn't provide just one that from my perspective is the go-to, because so much operator utilization and customization is critical to really all of them, because you already have enough false positives. The last thing you need is like MITRE ATT&CK false positives too, right? So just tread carefully, travelers, is I guess all I have to say on that one. Sorry to not be able to give a more detailed or specific answer.
All right, everybody. Adam, any final words before we end today?
No, thank you everyone for your time. Again, if you have any more questions for me, I'll be in the Discord for a while. I've got the Twitter. You can go to Scythe and contact me through that. And thank you everyone for your time. Hopefully this was helpful, and I really appreciate it.